Henry David Thoreau's essay on the duty of civil disobedience. Now, Thoreau is generally classified as an anarchist, and we'll see as we look through some of his political and moral philosophy, he definitely expresses what would be considered anarchist views. You'll also see, if you're familiar with, say, American libertarianism, you also see views that seem somewhat similar to that as well. So some of his quotable quotes, probably his most quotable quotes, include his view of what is the best government. And he begins with the view that the government is best, which governs least, which today in modern American political philosophy, such as it is, could be seen as a kind of libertarian or kind of the talking points of certain conservatives. Now, in terms of his anarchism, he takes the view the government is best, which governs not at all. Why does he have such a view of government? Well, he takes government to be, at best, an expedient. And he regards most governments, usually, and all governments sometimes, inexpedient. Now, his view here will be fairly critical and expressing like a clear kind of anarchist view, that is to say, the view that there should be no government. Now, again, people often confuse anarchism with there being like no organization, no order, no institutions, etc., but it's not that view. So Thoreau is not advocating just having chaos and madness. His view is against government that uses its coercive power against people. Now, one of his concerns about government is that it's liable to be, abused and perverted as a means of presenting and executing the will of the people. And his view is that the government, what it does, and it's supposed to execute the will of the people, at least on the political philosophy of Thoreau and most thinkers, kind of Lockean tradition, is that it ends up being abused and perverted. Now, today, we can look at this question, is this true? Because it's highly relevant to obeying the government. Because if the government is supposed to execute our will, government, of the people, by the people, etc., for the people, and it's not doing that, it's serving the interest of, not the people, then that would be relevant to the question of disobedience. Now, today, the answer, just objectively and empirically, is that Thoreau is completely right about, he's not obviously talking about today because he's super dead, but he's right. There's been, you'd want to, of course, look this up and check this from credible sources, but research has shown that in the United States, many things that are well supported by American citizens in general, very popular, 70, 80%, just don't get put into place. And that there's a pretty solid argument that America is mostly an oligarchy, having the few rich run it. And so Thoreau's conception of government today seems to be accurate, that it doesn't execute the will of the people, rather the will of not the people. So what does he think is the solution? Well, if you're familiar with some talking points by conservatives, libertarians, etc., this will sound quite familiar. He believes that governments show how people can impose on each other, even themselves, in order to gain an advantage. And this will sound very similar to conservative talking points. And again, if you are familiar with like famous or infamous libertarians like Elon Musk or whatever he is, and others, the view is that what the government should do is get out of the way. And Thoreau believes that is how the government would advance enterprise, by just not getting in its way. Now, today this manifests as, kind of anti-regulation views, etc. So here Thoreau sounds very talking pointy conservative and also very talking pointy libertarian. And he thinks that what government should do is basically leave people alone. So what does he think some of these problems are? Well, again, this will sound, if you're familiar with talking points from the American conservatives and libertarians, this will sound very familiar. He believes that trade and commerce are facing obstacles placed by legislators. And this is a view we see expressed today, that it's, the government, which is largely influenced by business and so forth, is putting obstacles in place. And the idea is that this is a bad thing, and the government should not do that. Now, he does kind of switch between being, an anarchist, like you said before, the best government is, no government at all. But he says his immediate kind of demand is not no government, but better government. So what is his justification for his view? Well, interestingly, his concern is majority rule, which is generally seen as a good thing. I mean, if we go back to our good dead friend John Locke, he advocates majority rule. Democracy is supposed to be majority rule, and we generally are, told in our education that, majority rule is a good thing, even though we generally don't actually have that in most cases. So Thoreau sees it as a bad thing. Why? Well, he believes that when the power is in the hands of the people, then the majority, is permitted to rule. So why is this bad for him? Well, because majority rule is based on not that the majority is most likely to be right, or that the majority is most likely to be fair and just to the numerical minorities. It's because of a very practical thing, that the majority is physically the strongest. And he says that a government in which the majority rules in all cases cannot be based on justice. So this kind of echoes Plato's criticism through Socrates about government, which is that, deciding by majority voting doesn't give you the best results. So it's an interesting criticism that majority rule is a bad thing because it doesn't necessarily lead to justice, and it can easily lead to unfairness. And so he's critical of that. So a good question to be is what kind of alternative does he offer? Now, what he thinks we should do, and this ties into our kind of overarching questions about conscience and obedience, and he raises the question, should citizens just resign their conscience to the lawmakers, the rulers? And he asks a rhetorical question, why then do we each have a conscience? And he contends that we should be people first, subjects afterward. And he's critical of respect for the law. Now, not surprisingly, we're generally told to respect the law and obey and comply. And Thoreau thinks this is a bad idea. What we should do instead is have a respect for the right, not like the political right, but the what is morally correct, rather than the law, because the laws, of course, can be bad. And he thinks that the only obligation that one has a right to assume is to do what one thinks is right. Now, on the one hand, this may sound good. People should do what is right, which seems like almost like a tautological claim, a claim that's just true by definition. What should you do? Well, you should do the right thing. Of course, the concern here is that if people just do what they think is right, then there's a concern about, well, what if they're wrong? And what if they're just going by, what if they're badly informed and haven't really thought it out? Or what if they're actually bad people who think they're doing right? And so that is, a concern, because on the one hand, it's intuitively appealing to say people should do what they believe is right. But then if you kind of think about it a little more, you might think about, well, what if the people are, they're just acting from anger or fear and haven't really thought things through, or they've been deceived by, so-called leaders telling them untrue things and acting upon that. So, for example, if we look at the attack on the Capitol on January 6th a while back, one could say that in a way they're acting in accord with what Thoreau says. Some of the people, one assumes, were acting sincerely, acting on what they believed was true, and they believed something wrong had happened, and they were acting what they thought was right. And that seems problematic. And so it's kind of this balance between doing what you think is right and then being kind of concerned about, but am I actually doing what's right? And Thoreau doesn't go into depth on this, but one could say that you should probably think things through, inquire whether it's right or not. But of course, doing moral philosophy before taking political action probably not very a common thing and maybe not realistic to expect. Now, he's very critical of law. So he kind of slides between things that would be very appealing to, talking points for certain conservatives, but then he just, heads into anarchy, which is, he claims that law never makes people more just, and the respect for it makes them into agents of injustice. And what he seems to have in mind is the Fugitive Slave, Act of the time period when he was around, and the law basically, crudely put, you want to read up more of the details in this, but it basically required people to arrest slaves that had escaped and take them back into, servitude. And he was very critical of this, not surprisingly. Now, he does make a good point that there can be very evil laws, and he's very broadly critical of laws. Now, this could be objected against. One could say there are good laws that make people better, and you might say, well, he's kind of making a rhetorical point, sweepingly, but he does have a point there, that laws often are bad. So what about the people who obey the state? Well, kind of his moral stance is that people shouldn't just simply obey the state, they should act in accord with their conscience. But he never seems to really seriously or deeply consider that people could have bad conscience as well. So what about the military and police? He raises the question, are soldiers people or small movable forts at the service of some unscrupulous man in power? Do they exist to serve just the will of whoever happens to be holding office, or should they, act according to their own conscience? Which is, a special case of a question of obedience versus disobedience. Because if one is, in the military, one takes an oath, like in the United States, and one is expected to obey. But then there's the moral question if the person who has, rightful authority gives orders that are, morally bad or possibly illegal. And of course, in the United States, soldiers are not required to obey illegal orders. Now, Thoreau thinks that most people who serve the state as effectively as machines, and he includes the military, the militia, jailers, constables, the posse comitatus, and others, where they simply, in most cases, he thinks people are engaged in moral judgment. They're simply just doing the will of the state. Now, of course, there can be cases where people are serving the will of the state and they're totally fine with doing things that Thoreau would consider bad. But this does raise the interesting question of, should those who are engaged in military and police operations, broadly construed, should they follow their conscience or follow the state? And again, we should consider cases where the individual is morally in the wrong, maybe the state is in the right. So what about people who hold office? Well, as Thoreau sees it, people in the military and the police largely serve the state with their bodies. That is to say, they're instruments of force. But what about people who serve the state with their heads, their minds, so to speak? Like legislators, politicians, lawyers, ministers, office holders, etc. Well, he thinks they are servants of the state as well. And he claims that they rarely make moral distinctions, and in a nice phrase, are as likely to serve the devil without intending it as God. And so he thinks that people who just, go along are being wrong if they're following bad decisions by other, political leaders. And again, this raises the moral question of, should people who hold these offices, and if they disagree with the state, should they disobey? And again, Thoreau doesn't consider the question of cases where, what if the individual's in the wrong? Because he generally seems to assume the state's going to be the bad side in these disputes. So as like I gave the example in the introduction, what if the state passes a law protecting certain groups like civil rights and so forth, and then someone who's, an official, because of their professed views, they don't want to respect those civil rights. Should the person disobey the state and deny the rights of citizens? And of course, one could say that, could make the moral argument that those people are in the right and the state is in the wrong. Now, what kind of people does he regard as heroes? Well, he says that very few people who are heroes, patriots, martyrs, reformers serve the state not with their body or their minds, but with their conscience, by moral judgments. And he thinks that the state is generally going to be bad, which is maybe not unreasonable. And he thinks that for the most part, people of good conscience would be opposed to most of what the state does. And so the state typically regards such people as enemies. Now, in the United States, this is something that does occur. For example, if we take, obvious example, Dr. King, when he was alive, he was considered by many, especially people in power, as a terrible threat, a criminal, etc. Look at his FBI file. But of course now, he's considered, even by people on the right, as kind of like a safe figure. Of course, they present him in a dishonest way, but now that he's dead, he's kind of a safe figure to use. And it does seem true for the most part in the United States. People who want to reform things, people who you'd see as like true patriots, committed to the ideals, as opposed to people who are, just say nationalists, committed to nationalist things. They often are, opposed by the state, and they have to overcome odds to change things. So it does seem to have a good point there. So what about revolution? Now, being an anarchist, not surprisingly, he does believe in revolution. And he claims, incorrectly, that all recognize the right of revolution. Obviously not everyone does, because someone who's a tyrant, etc., would say, no, there is no right to that. Now, he believes we have this right of revolution, and this is a right to refuse allegiance to and resist a government when its tyranny, or interestingly, its inefficiency, are great and unendurable. So he provides essentially two moral justifications for refusing to obey the government. One would be that it engages in tyranny, which he doesn't define in a great deal. And the other is, interestingly, when the government becomes too inefficient, becomes, I guess, bloated up with bureaucracy and unable to do its job. Now, from the standpoint of, say, the tradition of political philosophy that arises from thinkers like John Locke, this is the tyranny part is straight out of John Locke and similar thinkers, where tyrannical governments essentially have no justification. So if a ruler, for example, is acting to serve their own interest, to act upon their own petty desires and likes and dislikes, then they have lost their legitimacy. Locke doesn't talk about inefficiency, though, although he does believe the government should serve the good of the people, and so maybe a government that's doing that badly would be unjustified. And he has a nice metaphor comparing the state to a machine. He probably was not the first person to make this comparison, but the idea of the state as a machine, interesting metaphor. Now, he does note that in his analogy, all machines do have their friction. So he does consider maybe there can be cases where it does enough good to balance the evil. But basically saying that, just as a machine will have its own issues, but maybe worth using. Same with like the state. Maybe the state will do some bad stuff, but it does more good stuff, so it's justified. But then in continuing his metaphor, he says, when the friction has its machine, oppression and robbery are organized, and he says to get rid of that machine. And so he is concerned that a government could become a tool of oppression and robbery, stealing from the people and oppressing them, and it should be gotten rid of. And that is, pretty classical view. And so he thinks that would warrant getting rid of the state. So continuing with revolution and submission. Now he responds to this fellow Paley, who's also a dead philosopher now. And Paley takes the view that you should look at all civil obligation in terms of expediency. Essentially, it's in a way, a utilitarian or consequentialist kind of argument. So Paley argues that as long as government cannot be resisted or changed without public inconvenience, it is the will of God that it be obeyed. So essentially the idea is if it's, the cost of resisting the government or changing it is too high, then one should not change it. And so he presents, again, a very sort of consequentialist, utilitarian approach where you would do a weighing of each resistance. So if you're wondering, is this resistance, just, you would do a computation. Essentially, obviously you can't do it in exact numbers, but you would have the danger and grievance on one side and weigh that against the probability and expense of redress on the other. And the idea you would, if they balance out on net positive, then the resistance would be acceptable or change would be acceptable. If not, it would not be. And that can be presented again as a pretty standard utilitarian argument. More harm than good, bad, more good than harm, good. So what's his criticism of Paley? Well, Thoreau kind of doesn't explicitly, he doesn't come out and say that he's like a deontologist or rights theorist or something, but he essentially is criticizing the consequentialist approach, that you look at the pluses and minuses and weigh them. And he essentially says that you have to consider cases where it's not just a matter of the rule of expediency, and he does a very non-consequentialist position in which he says cases in which justice must be done regardless of the cost. And again, this is a broader debate in ethics between, do you basically go with the consequences, utilitarianism, consequentialism, or there are some things that even if the consequences are, terrible, highly, very costly, you still must do what is right, which in many cases can be cast as, say, a deontological viewpoint, or alternatively some other moral theory. Now, Thoreau thinks that, one must always go with what is just. And he uses an example. He says, if he's unjustly wrestled a plank from a drowning man, he must restore it to him, though he may drown. And Paley says this would be inconvenient, and Thoreau says, well, no, it would be unjust. And he says, as a practical matter, nations agree with Paley. They just look at the pluses and minuses and are not really concerned with justice. Now, to be fair to Paley and consequentialist thinkers, you can make a pretty good case that moral decisions should be made by consequences, even if we may intuitively think that an action, or from a deontological or rights view would just be wrong, that even though you might say the action would seem wrong, that one should take those actions. But Thoreau definitely believes in there being a justice beyond mere consequences, and interestingly, that even if something would be on a utilitarian standpoint, wrong, coming with a very high cost or high harm, that one must still do justice. And again, that's a much broader debate in ethics as to, what is it that makes things good or bad.